Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here. I hope you're doing well. And if you're not, I hope you are soon. And welcome back to Solo RPG Friday. On today's episode, we will discuss just what the heck is an RPG, anyways. I've talked a little bit about this in my journey to Darkroot Forest, my quest to Darkroot Forest to the Tunnel of Doom. But playing make believe with toys as a kid, when you played by yourself, it was a good thing. It could be a really good thing because you knew all of your own rules for your own worlds of make believe. You could take your G.I. Joe and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and pit those two against the Transformers, or maybe pit all of those against Star Wars, or have Star Wars versus Mask or Jason the Wheeled Warriors. You were in control of the stories, the power levels, the factions, and the lore of your own worlds of make believe. When you would have friends over and you would incorporate friends into that play, it could be a frustrating experience. Who wins? Can a lightsaber cut through He-Man's sword? Well, maybe in your world, but maybe not in your friend's world. No, Storm Shadow can't do that, but maybe your friend Storm Shadow could do that. Maybe his Optimus Prime was friends with Razorbeak. Maybe my Princess Leia was in a relationship with Snake Eyes. Hey, don't judge me. If only we had GURPS for toys. And that's kind of what RPGs are. That's kind of what role-playing games are. Role-playing games provide a governing framework for playing games of make-believe with other people, turning the madness of Calvin Ball into the controlled chaos of Blood Bowl. So my first experience with role-playing games in general, and my first experience was with Dungeons and Dragons, and that was in the mid 80s with the original red box. And really, we never really even actually played D&D. We just made characters and drew dungeons, and that's what we called playing Dungeons and Dragons, me and my buddy Matt. But D&D created this framework in a number of ways. There might have been games earlier than D&D, but D&D is kind of it's kind of the bedrock, the foundation upon which all modern, role-playing games are derived from or built upon. So, how did D&D create this governing framework? It provided rules for a persistent characters defined by classes, by stats, by abilities, items, and skills. It made it so you could write down certain words that had meaning on a piece of paper so you could keep a persistent character from one game to the next through multiple games, even at different tables with different people. So you were solidifying your version of Snake Eyes on that piece of paper, and somebody else could pick up that piece of paper and look at your character sheet and know exactly what your version of Snake Eyes was capable of. Two, it introduced the role of a judge, of a dungeon master, someone to oversee the proceedings, and someone to keep things in check, someone to make sure that everybody involved was playing by the same rules. Two or three, the dungeon master helped facilitate the fun. A good dungeon master, in my opinion, would be non-adversarial, and they worked with the players to help create the persistent world and its inhabitants. In that way, it became more of a collaborative storytelling exercise, or maybe more, in general, a collaborative creative exercise. Number four, it provided a system of rules to handle conflict, but not just martial conflict, not just combat, not just physical combat, but also social conflict. And that's a real key part to understanding the kind of things that tabletop RPGs did for gaming in general. Early tabletop RPGs would go on to influence early video games with things like Rogue and NetHack. And then on to more sophisticated games in the mid 80s with things like Bard's Tale, Wizardry, and Ultima. Bard's Tale and Wizardry were my introductions to computer RPGs. These games took some of the ideas, some of the philosophy, some of the things about tabletop RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons, but were laser focused on stats, numbers, and combat. These were the proverbial dungeon crawls. While your avatars in those games had many of the same stats as their Dungeons and Dragon counterparts, they had classes, they had strength and wisdom, they had skills and things. The games were mainly focused on dungeon crawling, on moving down corridors, opening doors, picking locks, killing monsters, and getting loot. While these things were also a huge part of D&D, the early computer games they weren't able to handle that kind of social conflict, that social interaction that D&D also allowed for. Most of the stats were used to boost elements of physical confrontation. As computers became more complex, so did the games, allowing players to make more choices and do things other than sneak around in dungeons and kill monsters. However, during the early days, tabletop games were still the ones doing most of the influencing. Then along came things like game books like Fighting Fantasy and Lone Wolf, and this provided a new avenue for young players to get into the feel and the mood and the genre, the world of tabletop role-playing games away from the computer and allowed us to do that by ourselves in a solo environment. Then there were also Japanese RPGs, which are, again, a very different thing from Dungeons and Dragons, a very different thing from even games like Bard's Tale and Wizardry, games like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. These took the numbers games to a whole new level. These games were really about the grind, exploring a world, fighting monsters, and gaining levels. Then would come games like Diablo. And games like Diablo took all of that and made it into a much more action orientated take on the genre, where it's almost all combat, all stats, and you're clicking fast, you're doing things quickly rather than selecting things from menus. But as some RPGs focus more and more on the combat and stats, other tabletop RPGs started to reject those ideas. You had things like Vampire the Masquerade LARP, which were almost all about social interactions, about creating systems of government, of having these interactions and having rules to govern ways to interact socially with people in real life. And then there are the more modern storytelling games, like the era of games that we're in now with games like Microscope and The Quiet Year and Fiasco, which completely reject stats and numbers and focus purely on storytelling. Fiasco is as different from D&D as D&D is from Bard's Tale, yet they all try to accomplish similar things. They're all RPGs, they're all role-playing games, but they do things differently. More and more video games started to incorporate more and more RPG elements, and as consoles and computers grew more advanced, so did the games, and soon video games were doing things that would in turn influence tabletop RPGs. MMOs started influencing role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, for good and bad. I think Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition was an attempt to bring in some of the video game influence into tabletop role-playing games. I liked some of that quite a bit, actually. Eventually, I'm going to need to do a video on why I think Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition is actually a really good board game and maybe not so great of a role-playing game, but that's down the line. But that was kind of for a new generation. The early days of tabletop role-playing games, the games were influencing video games, and so you had players who started at the table and then went to a computer. But around the time of Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition, maybe you had people who had grown up only playing computer role-playing games who are now getting interested in tabletop role-playing games. Now we have tabletop games based on video games, or set in video game settings. And we have video games set in tabletop role-playing worlds in a variety of different kind of meta levels. We have some games that are about playing games. We have all of these different ways of defining an RPG, different ways to present all of the various things that an RPG can do. So, what the heck is a role playing game? What are we even talking about when we say those three letters? What are the defining elements of a role playing game? That term can be so nebulous and it can mean so many different things to so many different people. So, here are some things that I think define an RPG for me. You will probably have your own list. You might agree or disagree with some of these. This is at least in terms for what I cover on the Dungeon Dive. My defining elements are more strictly focused on solo play because that's how I play most of my games. Number one, less structured play than a board game. Or if there is more structured play, the rules allow for some improvisation. I like things where I can inject my own creativity, where I can say yes or no to certain things. I think a really good example of a hybrid would be a game that I've been covering a lot recently is League of Dungeoneers. League of Dungeoneers has that structure play of a dungeon crawl where you are going into a dungeon, you are moving from space to space. There are rules for combat, there are rules to govern the play, but outside of the dungeons, you have a lot of room to improvise and to make your own things and to come up with your own stories. And so that's kind of a hybrid. But those are some of the things that I'm looking for when I'm playing an RPG is having more freedom. I like games. Number two is having the ability to have persistent custom characters and or worlds with the ability to convert those characters and worlds to other rule sets. The characters and worlds can live outside the confines of a single system. So when you buy a board game like Arkham Horror, and Arkham Horror has a lot of RPG elements to it. It has stats, it has gear, it has characters. But when you buy that game of Arkham Horror and you look at the characters that that game comes with, you look at its world, that world is kind of, and those characters are confined to that box. You know, you can't take those characters without a lot of work and put them in another game or put them in another setting. With a role-playing game, with a traditional tabletop role-playing game, you can do that. You can take a character from Scarlet Heroes and play that character in White Box. You can play that character in Dungeons and Dragons. You can play that character in GURPS. It doesn't really matter. You can always kind of convert one character to another system, and you can play within the world that you have created with a number of systems. Number three is the ability to have a lot of random encounters and to add random things from tool systems that exist outside of the system that you are currently working with. This is something that we talk about a lot. Something that I enjoy a lot is the ability to have the illusion of anything can happen in games. I like that. I like when games create that illusion. And it's really easy to create that illusion in a tabletop role-playing game because you aren't confined by a single system or a single set of tools. Number four is the ability to focus just on one thing: exploration, combat, social interaction, urban intrigue, if I so choose. I can sit down with a game like Scarlet Heroes and I can say, okay, for the next 2 hours, all I'm going to do is combat. I will set up a number of skirmish missions and just have combat. Or I could sit down for 2 hours and have no combat at all. Again, this is kind of a freedom where these systems allow you to choose the kind of experience you want to engage with. Number five, the power and permission to tailor every aspect of the game to fit my mood. While tabletop role-playing games provide a governing framework, almost all encourage the players to work outside of the confines of that framework. They give us, not only do they give us the tools to do so, but they give us the permission to do so. And they encourage the players to take what is provided and run with it in a way that they find interesting. Number six is the overall connecting story is experienced in an active way. I'm not just reading about things my character is doing, I am doing the things my character is doing. This is a big difference. And this is one thing that I find really important because the stories that I can come up with while connecting narrative dots are, for me, almost always more memorable than the stories I read written by people who design games. And number seven, this is another really important one to me, is not as concerned or concerned at all with winning and losing. The games are more about having an experience at the table, more about living your character's life. And you don't actually have a goal, an end goal in mind. You might have character driven arcs as goals, but you're not concerned about winning. And if you die or something, you're not really concerned about losing. You didn't lose a game. You just continue to play it, but maybe with different characters or in a different world. So, all right, so I hope you enjoyed this little discussion on role playing games in general. This is something that I'm going to do every once in a while. I like to do these kinds of just discussion videos. And let me know what do you look for in an RPG, and what are the defining elements that you think make an RPG? What makes a tabletop RPG different from even the kinds of games that we enjoy that have role playing game elements? So, all right, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. We will talk to you later. Bye bye.